That day, everything changed. I'd kept this secret for so long, thinking I'd never have the courage to tell. The caretaker's gaze, so intense and forbidden, made my heart soar. I tried to resist, but it was impossible to ignore the tension between us. What happened next was unexpected, irresistible, and completely out of control. You won't believe what I experienced. I'm Vanessa, a recently graduated doctor married to Max, a charming and passionate photographer. Our marriage seemed solid, but something in me was always searching for something more, a feeling I couldn't even name. When I agreed to spend some time on my family's farm in Goiás, I thought it would just be a break from the routine, a quiet breather. But it was there that I met Pedro, the caretaker's son, and everything began to change. He, at 24, was shy and quiet, but there was something about his presence that unsettled me. His eyes avoided mine, but at the same time, they carried an intensity that seemed to speak directly to something I was trying to hide inside. There was a tension in the air from the start, something I pretended not to notice, but which grew more and more. Pedro moved me in a way that I couldn't control, and as wrong as it was, each day on the farm brought me closer to a boundary that I knew I shouldn't cross. During a quiet walk around the farm, a torrential downpour took us by surprise. We ran together in search of shelter, but when we finally stopped, panting and wet, the silence between us spoke louder than any words. My clothes stuck to my body, leaving little to the imagination, and it was impossible to ignore Pedro's quick, nervous glances. He tried to look away, but his tension was evident. At that moment, I realized there was something there, something he was struggling to hide. After the rain, something changed between us. Over the next few days, Pedro could barely look me in the eye, but his presence said it all. He withdrew, spoke little, but every gesture. Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this. Every movement carried a tension that was impossible to ignore. It was as if he was fighting against something he couldn't control, and that gripped me even more. The silence between us seemed to scream, creating a whirlwind inside me. As much as we tried to act normally, it was already out of our control. The waterfall was indescribably beautiful, with crystal clear water flowing between the rocks, but none of that seemed to matter at that moment. What really struck me was the way Pedro looked at me, or rather, tried not to. He constantly looked away, but I could feel the intensity in his expression. It was as if he was in conflict, fighting something he couldn't avoid. During the walk, I decided to take my shoes off to get my feet wet, and as I bent down to touch the water, I felt his gaze fixed on me. It was only a second, but it seemed eternal. When our eyes met, he froze. Pedro scowled and lowered his head, but the blush on his face gave away everything he was trying to hide. That moment enveloped us in a silence so heavy that I didn't know if it was the surroundings or the tension between us that made time stand still. There were no words, but our eyes said it all. And it was then that I realized that nothing would ever be the same. After that moment at the waterfall, it was as if an invisible barrier had been broken. No matter how hard I tried to concentrate on other things, the memory of Pedro, his nervous look, and the blush on his face wouldn't leave my head. The image of him trying to disguise what he was feeling haunted me in every corner of the farm. Pedro avoided crossing my path, but when he inevitably did, he quickly looked away, as if he was afraid I would see what was in his eyes. This mixture of embarrassment and curiosity that he conveyed only made my heart race even faster. I, on the other hand, hardly recognized the woman I was becoming. I felt something so strong, an almost uncontrollable warmth, that I couldn't explain it. Something had changed between us. Something that seemed to grow with every shared silence, every fleeting encounter. And deep down, I knew there was no going back. Whatever it was already out of our control. The waterfall seemed like the perfect place to ease your mind, but that day, everything was far from peaceful. The sound of falling water, the heat of the sun, and Pedro's silent presence created a tense atmosphere. I knew he was glancing at me, even though he was trying to disguise it. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe something inside me was asking me to test the limits. I decided to enter the water, diving in slowly, feeling the coolness around me as my clothes stuck to my body. When I turned to look at Pedro, I noticed how he stood still, almost frozen, looking away hastily, but not before his eyes betrayed everything he was feeling. His flushed face and the nervousness in his gestures confirmed that the tension between us was not one-sided. The air seemed heavier and the silence unbearable. When our gazes met, I realized that something was about to happen, something that neither of us knew how to avoid. It was as if the inevitable was in front of us. The silence between us was no longer just an emptiness. It was a trapped scream, full of everything that couldn't be said. Pedro tried to resist, tried to remain harmless, but it was as if something inside him had given up the fight. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to occupy himself with anything to divert his focus. But when he finally looked up, his eyes met mine with an overwhelming intensity. It wasn't just desire, it was a mixture of vulnerability and courage that completely disarmed me. He tried to say something, but the words failed him. They came out fragmented, as if the weight of the moment was too much for him. I knew he was crossing a line that frightened him, but I also knew that at that moment, he had decided to give himself up. The wall between us was crumbling and the tension was almost palpable. Everything was clear, even without a full word. There was no need to say anything. It was all there, in that look. In that refuge, isolated by nature, the sound of the waterfall seemed to echo in sync with the tension that hung in the air. What began as innocent banter, with shy laughter and furtive glances, quickly took a turn that neither of us could control. Pedro, with his inexperienced manner, seemed hesitant, but every gesture carried a raw intensity that disarmed me. When his hand touched mine, the warmth of the touch ran through my body like a shock, and our eyes met in a silence that said more than any words. It was impossible to ignore what was happening. Every movement, every approach seemed wrong, but at the same time so inevitable that running away wasn't an option. His breathing was fast, and I knew that mine was too. That moment, forbidden and intoxicating, enveloped us like a storm. Everything I thought was right fell apart, leaving only the desire that pulsed between us. As if fate wanted to put everything to the test, Max showed up at the farm by surprise. I wasn't prepared to see him so soon, let alone in such an emotional state. He arrived smiling, with his usual charm, but it only took a moment for his eyes to focus on me in a way that made me shudder. "You look different," he said, leaning in to kiss me. My heart raced. The kiss, which should have been a natural gesture, turned into a moment of pure panic. When he pulled away, an unexpected comment paralyzed me. "You taste different today." My mind froze. Did he know? Was my face giving me away? I smiled awkwardly, trying to disguise the torrent of thoughts and fears that consumed me. As he continued talking about his trip, my body was there, but my mind was stuck on the memory of Peter. Every second next to Max made me feel that the weight of the secret I was carrying was too great to bear. Max seemed oblivious to everything, chatting away and smiling as if nothing was out of place. He walked around the house, praising the smell of the food and talking about the landscapes he had photographed, but I could hardly pay attention. My mind was stuck on the waterfall, on that moment when everything spiraled out of control. As Max continued, Pedro appeared in the corridor. He kept his head down, his steps hesitant, clearly trying not to bump into me or Max. My heart raced. It was impossible to ignore his nervous silence, the way he avoided our gazes. The air felt heavier, as if a single slip could reveal everything. When Max called Peter over to talk, I almost lost my breath. They were face to face, and I, in the background, felt my body tremble. The contrast was unbearable. Max with his confidence and Pedro, withdrawn, but with the memory of what we had shared in his eyes. Guilt consumed me, but desire still pulsed, bringing with it a dilemma that was impossible to ignore. After our encounter at the waterfall, Pedro seemed to have changed completely. The shy boy, who could barely hold his gaze, now stared at me with an intensity that made my heart waver. There was confidence in his eyes, but also something deeper, almost painful. It was as if he carried the duality of desire and regret, an internal struggle that I could feel even without words. When we passed each other, the silence was so dense that it seemed to shout out everything we couldn't say. He looked at me in a way that seemed to want answers, perhaps direction, but I was lost too. Had I helped awaken something inside him, or simply thrown him into a whirlpool of confusion? Every gesture he made, every look in his eyes, made my heart squeeze. I knew that I had crossed a line and that it was now impossible to turn back. Pedro was no longer the same, and when I realized that, I knew that I too had changed forever. When I returned to the city, I thought that time and distance would be enough to bury what had happened on the farm, but I was wrong. Every time I tried to concentrate on my work, the memory of Pedro's face appeared in my mind, like a shadow that I couldn't avoid. The tension in his eyes, the way he looked at me, as if he was carrying a world of unspoken feelings, was imprinted on me like a mark that was impossible to erase. His hands, trembling but so sure, still seemed to touch my skin, as if time had frozen in that instant. I tried to convince myself that it was all a mistake, something that should be forgotten, but the more I tried, the more vivid the memory became. Even in the simplest tasks, I found myself lost, reliving every second at the waterfall, every look, every touch. guilt and desire mixed in a whirlwind, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, Pedro had left a mark on me that wouldn't be easy to erase. My mind was in chaos. Should I carry on with the routine at Max's side, pretending that everything was fine, or find an excuse to go back to the farm? The idea of saying I wanted to help the community seemed plausible, but I knew it was just a way of getting close to Pedro again. He was everything I shouldn't want, but the memory of his eyes, his touch, made it impossible to erase him from my mind. Max, always attentive and reliable, was the logical choice, the stability that any sensible person would choose. But why, then, did my heart insist on returning to that place? Click like now and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this. To that forbidden connection that made me question everything. The nights next to Max felt like a punishment, his every touch reminding me that there was something more, something I couldn't have, but that my body and soul desperately craved. With each passing day, the weight of the dilemma suffocated me. Returning to the farm could destroy everything, but perhaps it was the only way to save myself. The days passed, but my mind seemed stuck on that moment on the farm, on Pedro's memories. It was like an unfinished book, a story that beckoned me to write it, even though I knew the ending could be disastrous. I looked at Max, so dedicated, so stable, and felt suffocated by guilt. He had no idea of the storm inside me, of the nights I pretended to sleep while my mind wandered back to the waterfall, to Peter's touch, to the confused, intense glow of his eyes. I knew that if I went back to the farm, I would be playing with fire. Pedro was a forbidden desire, a choice that could crumble everything I had built. My marriage, my reputation, my very notion of who I was. Max was the life that made sense, the security of a solid relationship, but at the same time, he didn't fill the void I'd felt for a long time. Pedro, with his intensity, his inexperience, was the spark that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt for years. Going back would have meant risking everything, but ignoring what had happened seemed impossible. It was like a wound that I kept poking at, unable to let it heal. I wondered if Pedro felt the same way, if he thought about me as often. Was he also torn between desire and guilt, or had he put what had happened behind him? This doubt consumed me, leaving me paralyzed between certainty and uncertainty. Looking at Max and imagining the impact my choice could have on his life broke my heart. He didn't deserve it. But I also couldn't go on living as if nothing had changed. The thought of losing Peter forever was unbearable, but the fear of destroying my marriage made me terrified. What if I risked everything and in the end found out that it was just a passing illusion? What if the price was too high to pay? Now I ask you, what would you do if you were me? Would you maintain the stability of an apparently perfect life? Or would you give in to a desire that could change everything, for better or for worse? This doubt eats away at me, but perhaps hearing other perspectives will help me find a way out. Leave a comment and help me decide, because I don't know what to do anymore. This story doesn't end here. Listen to it all by clicking on the exclusive playlist on the right, or click on the video on the left and listen to the best story on the channel.